What's new?
I'm Zev Elef, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College. And today, it's really a pleasure to be with Dr. Mijal Bitton. She is a scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, a sociologist trained at New York University on American Jewish life. And Mijal, what I'm so excited about talking about today is that not only have you done so much work on a population, the American Syrian community, that really it's a thin literature. I don't want to over-exaggerate and suggest that you can read it in a week, but you can read it in a week. And what I want to talk about today, number one, is about this community and some of the findings, but also what are some of the gaps? As you know, in this series, we've gone from the colonial period until today, and perhaps one of the most obvious holes in the literature of American Jewish history, American Jewish studies, has been in contemporary studies or the post-war period, and we simply just don't know enough about all of the variegated forms of American Jewish life.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me here. 100%, and maybe I'll tell you about my own experiences in starting this research and kind of what I was encountering. When I started off as a grad student at NYU, I became really compelled by questions around minority populations and how can you maintain a minority community in America. And I delved into American Jewish history and also the sociology of American Jews, trying to see what exists out there. And I just kept feeling like I couldn't detect in any of them portraits of communities like the ones that I had lived in. At that point, I had lived in the Persian Jewish community in Great Neck, and I was very familiar also with the Syrian community in New York. So these are communities that are Sephardic, and I am calling them Sephardic because of many reasons. Sephardic communities that were shaped in a Muslim majority context, and that frankly are really understudied and underappreciated in terms of scholarship of American Jews. And let me point out one of the ways. One of the things that became so obvious to me is that not only was scholarship missing, but that the categories hadn't been laid out for this kind of work. So the example that I usually take is as follows. Let's say that I take my husband. My husband, Sian, was born in America to Egyptian Syrian parents who escaped from Egypt in the 50s. And I would ask, so what should we call someone like Sion, like my husband, right? What are the categories that we can call him? Okay, so we can call him Egyptian, we can call him Syrian, we can call him Jewish, but what about the pan-ethnic categories? So if I would turn to certain scholars who do Sephardic history and who have a very limited category for Sephardic Jews, to Sephardic Jews who came originally from the Iberian Peninsula, they would look at Sion, they would say, okay, he's not Sephardic. He doesn't fit within this rubric. Okay, fine. So then what do we call him? So some activists would say, okay, so he's a Mizrahi Jew. Mizrach means, Easterner. And that's actually totally erroneous, because when you look at scholarship of Mizrahiyut, Mizrahi Jews, it's a pan-ethnic category that emerges in Israel after 1948. So this is a long way of saying that we actually haven't done the work to figure out the categories to call these populations. Some of the things that I argue is that we should look at people like my husband, like Sion, and call them Sephardic, because that is the organic category they use internally to self-identify, and they provide plenty of rationales as to why they think of themselves in this way.
Number one is, so what I'm hearing from you is it requires a new categorization. You can't rely on certain archetypes. You can't rely, for example, you can't begin your books with migration history of colonial Jews and the German migration, the Eastern European migration. You really have to work adjacent to that.
Yeah, and that's really complicated. Also, because I'm not a historian, so I don't actually I cannot quote any scholar to give me good figures, for example, of immigration of Syrian Jews, or later post-1965 immigration of other communities from Muslim majority countries. This work just hasn't been done. So the best I can do is give some educated guesses and to show some of the limitations of what we know. And partially that's why I chose to ask some contemporary questions, because I'm also really intrigued by the contemporary issues in terms of acculturation and integration and the like. But you're 100% right that there's a certain basis that is absent for many reasons, by the way. I think that some people point out certain biases in which scholars privileged Ashkenazi Jews from European backgrounds. And while I think that that's probably true, I think the picture is more complicated. I can tell you, for example, that the Syrian Jewish community that I studied, a lot of them really don't like to be the object of study. And I actually write about their construction of memory and how they don't want to be included in certain historical archives. And I bring different data as to why I understood things in this way. So I think it's a complicated picture in which we have to think both about biases and gaps, and also what does it mean about Ashkenazi liberal American Jews who have largely adopted the study of history as a way in which to talk about their identity and their contributions to America, and about other communities and populations who perhaps reject or feel threatened by the universalizing arm of history, and they decide that that's not an enterprise they want to actively or enthusiastically participate in. Sorry, I'm bringing a lot of things all at the same time. But,
I'm blown away. And now, part of your work has been to identify where else are the gaps, and that's not just historical gaps that historians, and really I'm calling it American Jewish studies quite deliberately, sociologists, literary scholars, we're all doing this together. The field has evolved in such a way, but also methodologically, where is there room to grow and move forward?
Yeah, well, I think in general, we haven't done the best job of investigating communities that have been shaped by post-1965 immigration. Many of these communities, we can talk about populations like Persian Jews or Bukharian Jews or Russian-speaking Jews or others. So many of them, I think, they're more recent communities, so there's a reason why scholarship still needs to catch up. But, and these are some of the things that I argue in my more public-facing work, I also think that sometimes these communities inhabit narratives or moral ways of thinking that can feel threatening to certain liberal projects. So it's not always so easy to have robust diversity projects with all these populations, which might contribute to the methodological gaps and blind spots that we have both in scholarship and also in communal institutions.
Some of the more recent works that have been attempting to negotiate, and I take it very well that it's one thing to miss a community and miss a population. It's another thing if the population won't offer their archives or cooperate. A scholar can't just make things up. What are some of the recent works that have been trying to trailblaze?
Now, for example, there's been some new scholarship on Iranian Jews in LA, specifically some new scholarship on Iranian women and how they transmit different forms of Jewish identity. There's been a lot of new scholarship on Russian-speaking Jews, and I think that we definitely have a growing field there. When it comes to there's Ilana Cooper wrote a book about the Bukharian Jewish community and different global networks. There's been some books, and again, forgive me, I have the worst memory on this, on like the music of Syrian Jews. Two good books there, books on music of Bukharian Jews. So there is some work and some scholarship on these populations. There's also, and this is not the same, but it does give us some useful theories and categories. There's, of course, a huge field of studies on Mizrahi Jews in Israel, which again, it's like a very, very different context, which must be emphasized how different it is, but it does give us some tools. So for example, I know that when I was trying to study Syrian Jews and figure out, are they Orthodox? How Orthodox are they? How do we think of them within denominational categories, which tend to have been the norm for scholars of American Jews? I definitely took tremendous advantage of scholars like Nissim Leon, who was in my dissertation committee, or Yaakov Yadgar or others who problematize when we only have like the religious secular spectrum or denominations in the American context, and they theorize traditionalism, Masortiut, and they actually give new tools and techniques to approach Jewish communities from Muslim majority countries and to figure out what are the categories and the language that we're going to use to understand them and to examine them.
Now, it's one thing to create new categories and new areas of scholarship that have to be understood apart from the existing literature, but do you see any challenges in bringing the field together? I mean, that you're going to have this new scholarship, whether it's Syrian Jews or it's Bukharian Jews, but it seems to me that this literature ought to speak and be able to put in conversation with the Ashkenazi-centric histories.
Yeah, and let me name two challenges here. One challenge, I think, actually has to do with Sephardic studies more broadly, because Sephardic studies are this really broad umbrella. So you have people who are studying Ottoman Jews in the 1600s, and then someone like me who's studying Syrian Jews in Brooklyn today. And from an outsider perspective, it's like, okay, you're both talking about Sephardic Jews, but the Sephardic Jews that we're studying are like so different from each other. So this is a very small field with not that many researchers, and the variance in what we're studying is very, very different. So I think that's one of the challenge actually in terms of having some sort of cohesive notion of studies here. That can be a little bit difficult. So that's number one. I think a second challenge that comes up here has to do with the relationship between activism and scholarship. I sense the fact that there is tremendous, and one that I share, like impetus and an activist urge to bring visibility to communities that have been underrepresented. But I think that sometimes, even when we have very good intent and when we have positive activist goals, the scholarship still needs to maintain a really high levels of rigor and being really careful. So I can't tell you the number of times that I hear people, again, really well-meaning, talk about whiteness and Ashkenormative as though this is the same thing. And I'm like, Jewish ethnic identity and constructs, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, and then Jewish racial identities are actually very different from each other. And no one has yet to do the case that this should be understood as somehow corresponding to each other. So I guess I'm naming the part of the challenge is that this field is being shaped by activist concerns, and that I am anxious or nervous that sometimes those activist concerns don't always align with the scholarship that we have or the work that we actually have to do. And then, like to I guess to the last part of the challenges, I absolutely agree that we have to make some bridges in terms of what this means. So, for example, when I look at Syrian Jews, I can't pretend like they're still stuck in the same place in Syria that many of them left a century ago. So in a fascinating way, as a sociologist, I have to ask myself, where do I detect the genealogies of the ideas and influences, right, that come from that past? And I don't assume that a European Jewish context and a Syrian Jewish context are the same things. But at the same time, I cannot then ignore the fact this is a community being shaped as a minority within a minority, as a Jewish Syrian minority within a Jewish Ashkenazi minority within America. And that in many ways they have been shaped and influenced by Ashkenazi Orthodoxy or by Ashkenazi American populations. So there definitely have to be, so yeah, I agree with you that we have all of these questions. And I think sometimes I find this challenging, other times I find this exciting, which means that there's actually new things to ask and new ways to conceive as to the possibilities of what Jewish life in America can look like.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.